Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock. Crowds have gathered in St. Peter's Square to find out the next leader of the Catholic Church. Cheers rang out after white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, signalling the election of the next Pope. It took more than 130 cardinals around 24 hours to make their decision. These people say they're fortunate to see such an historic moment.
It's very exciting also because we were here and how to explain the feeling of this historical
We arrived here this afternoon, so it's the first time, and I think that happens one time in life, so it's so exciting.
The successor to Pope Francis is due to be revealed shortly. Also this evening, Sir Keir Starmer and Donald Trump have celebrated a great deal between the UK and US. The Prime Minister was part of a conference call with the White House earlier.
With this President, this Prime Minister, we've managed to achieve what many people have tried to achieve for many years. It feels completely historic.
It will see US tariffs on British steel and aluminium scrapped and levies on cars reduced to 10%. In return, the UK has agreed to reciprocal market access to beef and will remove taxes on American ethanol. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 27 points at 85.31. The pound buys $1.32 and €1.18. LBC weather, dry and settled tonight for most of the UK, a low of 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Some days there isn't enough news, and some days, frankly, there is too much. Bank of England's cut interest rates, Keir Starmer has cut a big deal with Donald Trump, and oh yes, apparently we have a new Pope. Let's start with the Trump deal, because this is clearly good news for British car makers and steel makers. The UK has been given a quota of 100,000 Range Rovers, Jaguars, Aston Martins and other cars, which will now face tariffs of not 27%, but 10%. Steel tariffs will also be slashed. And all of this should save tens of thousands of jobs and, for the time being, perhaps the British steel industry. Good news as well for people working in AI in the UK and for Rolls-Royce, whose engines will continue to power Boeing jets. In return, Britain is going to buy a lot of Boeing jets and make it easier for the Americans to sell us their beef, chemicals and machinery. Now, this is not slam dunk. It's not all over. There is more negotiating to go on, and those general 10% tariffs are still there in place. We don't yet know enough about the losers. But overall, this seems like a closer, bigger deal than anyone outside the room had expected a week ago. Britain has experienced some deep lows and heavy blows recently, and there will inevitably be more hard times ahead. But for Keir Starmer, and I think for Britain, today has been a good day. Hot on the heels of the Indian trade deal, which, for all its downsides, should bring us more growth, Britain has been the very first to sign a deal with Trump's United States. All that sucking up may not have been elegant. The letter from the King, the offer of a state visit, the pressure from Whitehall to try to get the Open golf tournament back to Trump's Turnberry course. But for the country generally, well, perhaps it's worked. If Britain can then get a good deal on food and agricultural trade from the EU in the Reset Summit due the week after next in London, and that's a big if perhaps, then the Starmer government has gone a long way to at last finding a route to get us the economic growth we had nearly despaired of. That and the cut in interest rates by the Bank of England to 4.25% does not suddenly end the missteps at home over tax and benefits. It won't make the Prime Minister Mr. Popular overnight. It won't make the great reform revolt melt away. But for Labour, it gives the first glimmering of hope that there is, after all, a way out of the current mess. This is not the dawn, but it's a gleam. It's the first spangle of light in the political murk for quite a long time. And let's begin tonight by trying to answer an absolutely central question. Could this mark the beginning of the end of the Trump trade war waged against the whole world? Here to help discuss this is Maureen Khan, economics editor at The Times. Maureen, great to have you on the show. Can I ask, before we get to that, whether you have heard anything about the digital sales tax? Has that gone? And what you know about the film industry tariffs?
So, in a surprise, the digital sales tax, which is a sales tax applied by the UK on some of the biggest platforms, mainly American companies, is staying. We thought that would be one of the first sacrificial lambs to go, but it's not part of this agreement, so it's staying. So I think in that sense, you mentioned a lot of the sucking up that was happening by the British government. At least on this, they have stood firm, and I think that's going to be very welcome by lots of parts of this country, particularly as it's a tax, and we need as much tax revenue as we can get right now. So that is going to stay in place, which is a relative surprise.
We certainly do need as much as we can get. Maureen, we both know that it's very, very dangerous for journalists like us to give early verdicts on complicated deals. But at first sight, this seems to be a very good deal for Britain.
Yes, and I think let's just think about the politics of the deal for both sides. I think we have two leaders in Donald Trump and Keir Starmer, who I would say it's getting to a point of desperation for both of them to come up with deals for various reasons. I think for the Trump administration, there's been so much volatility in the markets that to get something over the line is very helpful for their optics before this big meeting with China at the weekend. And we already know that Keir Starmer's facing so much economic pressure, particularly after the local election results, that it was also ideal timing for the UK to be the first country in line. And we know other countries were really desperate to get in line. India was desperate to be the first country that was going to get a trade deal with the US. I think they had to settle with us, with the UK, to get sort of compensation. So I think that politically, the optics for both sides are very, very helpful. I would, however, just caution that there are major, major issues, and you've already mentioned services. Something else worth mentioning is pharmaceuticals. We don't know where these two massive industries for the UK lie in terms of the Trumpian worldview. None of that detail was given today. I'm not expecting too much in the next few days. So those are still open questions about what the trading relationship in services and also in pharmaceuticals is going to look like.
So, yes, a long way still to go. But if, as I said, we've got the India deal, we've got this deal, and if somehow when it comes to so-called SBS, agriculture and food and so on, we are able to strike a decent deal with the EU later in the month, would that, do you think, begin to show a route to growth that we haven't seen for a while?
It's very difficult to say that trade in any of these areas is going to be a route to growth. For now, all we can say it's an alleviation of pressure. This is very important, what's happened today for the car sector and for the steel sector. These are pretty beleaguered industries, and sectorally it's incredibly significant that there has been a diplomatic breakthrough. But I think macroeconomically, a lot of the things that we've been hearing from this government over the last few days is relatively insignificant. I think the bigger action is, if talking about short-term boosts, is very much just the monetary policy outlook. Actually, it's the Bank of England which is really the only game in town. They would have to cut interest rates pretty fast and pretty quickly for people to really feel a benefit in their pockets for over the next couple of months.
Well, today they've started, haven't they? There's another 0.25% cut. And everything I hear is going to be the first of several.
That's a very interesting question. I think before today we would have said, yes, it's the first of several, but the bank is being very cautious. It's maintaining its language. It wants to be gradual. It wants to be careful. The central banks are being far more ambitious and saying, you know what, this tariff issue is going to have a chilling impact on the economy and we're going to cut rates fast. The bank is not promising to cut rates fast. If anything, today was a sign that they're so divided over the monetary policy outlook that we might not actually get the jumbo rate cuts that lots of people were expecting. I think maybe 2 or 3 this year. But again, we're starting from a position where interest rates are above 4% and they're probably going to stay above 3%, whatever happens in the next coming months.
Maureen, this has been a short conversation, which I have learned a great deal very fast. Thank you so much. Let's turn now to somebody who is a Trump ally, somebody who served as his Deputy National Security Advisor in the first term, Katie McFarland. Katie, great to have you back on the show. This is, I think, looks like a good day for your country and a good day for mine.
I think it's just spectacular. I mean, spectacular for both of our countries is something we've been trying to do with the UK government for a long time. It was in the first Trump term. It was well on its way. There were several sticking points. But, between your political problems with Boris Johnson, between our political problems with the efforts to impeach Donald Trump, it never got done. Now it's done. And not only is it done, but the way in which it's done. It's not only, it's the 80th anniversary of VE Day, when really the United States, the United Kingdom stood shoulder to shoulder. You got a very
great day to do it. Yeah.
Great day to do it. The symbolism is amazing. And also it's a very pro-British American president. So I think it's not just the specifics of the deal. It's just a broader relationship. I really see that, U.S. and UK are going to have a closer relationship going forward, whether it's going to be on trade, whether it's going to be on national security issues, energy security issues, NATO issues. It's just a great day all around. And remember, as our economy starts improving, it starts growing, which we anticipate it will, for the domestic stuff that we're doing with tax cuts, with deregulation or streamlining regulation, our economy is going to grow. So if British goods are now sold in the United States without really any real roadblocks, small tariffs, equal access to each other's markets, we're going to buy more of your stuff. So I think it's just a good day all around.
That's really, I was listening carefully to Donald Trump earlier on, and he emphasized, you used the word security there, and he emphasized there was a very important security aspect to this, probably around steel and technology. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's something that hasn't really been properly focused on here.
Yeah, so we look at supply line issues very seriously. We never really thought about it before, but when COVID hit, and remember when President Trump initially called it, the Chinese virus or Wuhan flu, the Chinese objected quietly and privately. They objected to President Trump and said, don't you dare do that. If you do, we're going to cut off your pharmaceuticals, particularly your antibiotics, which are largely made either in China or the precursor ingredients are made in China. So all of a sudden we realized, whoa, we have supply chain issues. And that's national security, health security, economic security, but that's national security. So I think that the old definition of national security and foreign policy used to be tanks and airplanes and nuclear weapons. Now it's a much broader issue. And so it's not just that the United States wants to reshore manufacturing and reshore critical industries, but we want to friendshore. So if the United States, the United Kingdom joined at the hip, this is really good for us because it's going to improve your economy, your manufacturing, it's going to improve ours, and it's also going to give us that sort of measure of confidence that no matter what happens, we're going to have access to steel. No matter what happens, we're going to have access to energy, or you're going to have access to our energy. No matter what happens, we have access to each other's pharmaceuticals and food.
That's really important. But let's get down to beef. And agricultural product, because that has been a long-standing problem. And people have said, I think for years and years and years, the problem with any deal between our countries is around chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef. We have different traditions around food between our countries. In your understanding, clearly this is good news for American beef farmers, but Britain is not going to be accepting hormone-treated beef, as I understand it. How does that work?
Yeah, I think that's true. But as President Trump said in his remarks today, he said, look, it's going to give everybody options. It's going to give your consumers options. It's going to give our consumers options. You're still going to have your internal regulations that you're not going to, the issues that you've talked about, whether it's over chicken, whether it's over beef. But the interesting thing that President Trump said, almost as an aside, is, with Bobby Kennedy, it looks like we're going more in your direction than you're going in our direction. So
fascinating,
maybe,
absolutely fascinating,
hugely fascinating. So maybe you got it right. Maybe we're going to import more British beef than you're going to import American beef. We'll see.
I'm told we're running out of time, but I have one last question I just really want to ask you, which is this deal, and Donald Trump talked about a deal with the Swiss quite soon, and even with the Chinese. Do you think we are seeing the sign that the great Donald Trump tariff war is in fact a series of individual negotiations he wants to do? In other words, rather than being a big philosophical thing that's going to change the world economy, it's about getting the attention and notice of other countries and then doing deals. Is that what we're seeing, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as he said, he had to blow the world trade system up, which he's done, in order to renegotiate the deals. And they will be bilateral, maybe with the exception of the EU, but they will be U.S. bilateral agreements. Britain first, probably India to follow, maybe Japan to follow. But the big one is going to be China. And that's why Secretary Bessent is going to Switzerland this weekend to meet with the Chinese.
It's an absolutely gripping moment in our mutual history. Katie McFarlane, thank you very, very much for talking to LBC. As you've just heard, one of the sticking points traditionally has been food standards and the impact the deal could have on battered British farmers. Are we heading for more tractor protests outside the House of Commons, I wonder? Let's speak now to the National Farming Union's Livestock Board Chair, David Burton. David, it's really hard to work out the detail of this, and perhaps you haven't been able to yet, but from what you have seen, is this good or bad news for British agriculture?
I think looking at my focus is beef, and that's what I've been looking at. And yes, it is early days, so need to get into the detail. But on the face of it, we've lobbied government very hard in the last week or so to make sure that our standards have been protected. And it looks as if that's happened. So I'm very pleased about that. And the trade deal, I think it's 13,000 tonnes of beef. That's not a huge amount, but it's reciprocal. So that means we can send it to the US and they can send some here. And I think we've wanted to trade with the US for some time. So on the face of it, that's probably a good thing.
So it's not the sort of sell out to the farmers that some people were fearing. That's quite a win for the government, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they had assured us that they would stay by our standards, and they have done that. So they've done what they said they were going to do and what they should do. So that's a good thing. And I think, there will be opportunity for British beef to make its way out to the US. We have a world-renowned
That's really good news. That's really good news. Donald Trump was saying earlier on, actually, we have lots of different kinds of beef. In other words, if you don't like our hormone-treated beef, we've got other kinds of beef, all sorts of varieties. Is that true?
They basically have the majority of US beef is hormone treated, but they do have non-hormone treated beef, and that's what we will be dealing with. So it is a different product. We grass finish ours generally, and theirs is cereal finish. So it's a different product. Ours a leaner product and I would say a more healthy product. So I think the US consumer will enjoy our product, and we'll see how it works in the UK for US beef.
Well, it's a very, very interesting day. Perhaps one day we'll be able to teach the Americans what decent cheese tastes like as well. But for now, David Barton, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC. And now some breaking news. The name of the new Pope has been revealed. My LBC colleague Sheila Fogarty is here to tell us more. Sheila.
It's an American Pope. We haven't had an American Pope for a very long time, yeah. It's
not Donald Trump.
It's not Donald Trump. No, you can put that
Pope
picture out of your mind. It's a man called Robert Prevost. He is an American, Chicago-born, so we'll have a Pope with a Chicago accent, but he has spent a great deal of his ministry in Peru. So another man very familiar with the feel and the culture of Latin American Catholicism. Also has spent a great deal of time in Rome, so he will be known by many of the other cardinals, which has clearly been contributed to this, I think. But the speed with which they've chosen him is really interesting. I was listening to an American bishop whose podcast I listened to, Bishop Robert Barron, and he was saying yesterday, almost definitively, we've got some really great talents in this country, but I'm afraid we're not going to get an American Pope because we're a superpower. But it's deemed that Francis's papacy changed all of that, really, because it basically said this is a universal church. There are no silos and there are no special nationalities that get to be Pope. And it turns out that includes America.
And where does Cardinal Robert Prevost stand in the kind of liberal versus conservative spectrum? And do we know anything about the name he's going to choose?
We don't. Well, I'm afraid I've lost track online as to whether the announcement has come on the balcony itself or whether it's just been.
It seems to be on the balcony from the pictures that I'm looking at, Sheila.
Well, in that moment of announcing, they normally say the Pope's. The
he's
name
going to
that
be
he will
Pope
take.
Leone. Pope Leone. I don't know.
Pope Leone. Oh my gosh! Right.
Pope Leone the 14th.
Wow.
It's a long time since we've had a Pope Leone, isn't it?
Well, we've had a few Leos, but I'm not sure we've had a Leone, or a long time since we had a Leone. I think that what the Cardinals were looking for, I think, in all of this was somebody who would, there will be the, quotes, conservatives who will be furious that it's not one of the African cardinals who will be focused heavily on church dogma. But I think given that Prevost has spent so much time in Latin America and so much time in Rome, I think he will have been heavily influenced. I imagine he will have been heavily influenced by Pope Francis in all of this, because
that's really interesting.
The church needs a unifier. It needs a unifier, no question.
Yeah. So this is somebody who is going to carry on, we hope, as it were, we don't hope anything, but he is somebody who's going to carry on the tradition of Pope Francis of reaching out to the poor, wanting a less grand, a less swaggering papacy, if I can put it like that.
Potentially, but he also, the key thing, I think, is that he very much has a global experience, and that will matter enormously in this global age that we live in. And that was something that was a heavy focus of Pope Francis, as you know. It was interesting in the early chit-chat about this, about Prevost being a possible papabile. Now he's the Pope, so we can change that. people kind of poo-pooed it, partly because he was American and partly because he was little known. But my first thought when the white smoke came really relatively early on in this process, I thought, right, they've either gone for one of the absolute solid papabeles that they've been naming time and time again, or amongst that group, somebody has really stood out and impressed them for one reason or another. This stuff will start to emerge eventually. And it looks to be the latter. It looks that one of the lesser... it's a bit like in the Grand National, Andrew, where there's a solid horse that could win but probably won't, and then it does. And I think he'd probably fall into that, really. So he has been very vocal. I mean, on abuse, you cannot get away from the issue of child sexual abuse, and he's been very vocal on that.
Yeah, very vocal. Well, that's really, really important. Sheila, thank you so much. What a fascinating evening it's turning out to be. Thank you. Now then, as I said earlier, today is about a lot more than trade and even the new Pope. Up next, we're going to reflect on the 80-year anniversary of victory in Europe. But you're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr. The time now, 6:20.
The UK-US trade deal. For full details and analysis, stay with LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Winston Churchill.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
It was a privilege. I was lucky to be smack at the heart of the 80th anniversary of VE Day service at Westminster Abbey earlier today. That was a short extract of Winston Churchill's spine-tingling VE Day speech from 1945. And today's service was everything you would expect and hope. Glittering, moving, immaculately organised. Angel-faced choristers and military trumpeters, the King and Queen, William and Kate, the Prime Minister and many other politicians past and present, leaders of all the major faith groups, uniforms of all kinds, copes and robes and swords and feathers, clothing stitched with gold, soaring music, pomp. In short, the British state put on a jolly good show. It didn't miss the human touch. There were extracts from letters of the time. There were veterans in wheelchairs, probably for the last time at an event like this. Children and teenagers were included in the service, and its religious heart was Christ's enthusiasm for the peacemakers, not didn't we do well self-glorification. But it was very grand. It shimmered and glittered in the ancient abbey, and that, in a way for me, is a problem. A national commemoration is big and general and abstract, but memory, which matters more, is personal. Those who died were just as various and flawed and different as we are. They weren't numbers or crosses, but quirky, in-your-face, real people. When I'm thinking of the war, I'm thinking of my chain-smoking grandpa who fought in Italy, my dad's oldest brother, killed in the Navy, still a teenager, at Dunkirk, and my second cousin, Freddie Malcolm. Freddie is a kind of family hero. He was in the RAF, but he was also a young man of strong religious views who refused to be involved in operations which would kill women and children. So he declined to go into Bomber Command. And as we think, as a kind of punishment, I'm not even saying it was unjustified, he was sent to fly Spitfires for a little-known outfit. And he died 83 years ago, this weekend, over Norway. I don't know what he would have thought about the Britain he fought to save. But I do know that I have spent the last 45 years as a journalist able to say whatever I liked about politicians or the government, and never once, not for a moment, being scared or intimidated by the power of the state. And that, and Freddie, for me, was what today was really all about. Now, part of one of the Spitfires Freddie flew is on show this weekend in London. And to explain more about that, I'm going to turn next to the military historian Tony Hoskins, who has been investigating the story of Freddie and those who flew with him.
Freddie Malcolm's a fascinating man. I mean, I've researched him now for about 6 or 7 years, and he flew unarmed reconnaissance during the Second World War, which was a very small, tight-knit community, but doing really vital work. And Freddie flew so many missions to bring back this vital intelligence.
And they were unarmed because the weight of the camera meant they had to take the guns out. Is that right?
Yeah, and fuel. So a Spitfire would typically only fly for about 90 minutes, and these guys needed to fly effectively to the Arctic Circle and back again, so up to 4.5, 5 hours. So all the armour plate came out, they were totally defenceless, and they'd go off on their own and fly these missions right across Europe.
And his job was to check that the battleship Tirpitz was still in its Norwegian fjord and not out threatening the British Arctic convoys. And it's been described to me as a kinds of suicide missions these guys were on.
Oh, completely. So, I mean, the Germans were never going to tell us what they were up to. So the only way we could do is to see eyes on at the time what was happening. And Tirpitz was a massive threat to all of the supply chain that was going backwards and forwards between here and Russia and, of course, across to Canada. And he was out there trying to make sure that these ships were not going to be a threat to those convoys that were moving.
And he did this again and again and again, flying over the North Sea with very few instruments by modern standards. It was very dangerous. I think he did 12 or 13 missions before he was finally perhaps chased by German planes. He hit a mountain and was killed.
That's right, just outside Trondheim on the 10th of May 1942. So just coming up to the anniversary.
Coming up to the anniversary now. Well, I always remember him very much. And he was part of this organisation, the PRU, or the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. Most people will not have heard of it, and yet it was really important in the war. Just tell us a bit about it.
Absolutely, it was. I mean, most people would have heard of Bletchley Park and the Enigma programme, but that develops just about 15% of the information that we use for the tactical and strategic planning of the Allied campaign in the Second World War. 80% came from photographic reconnaissance. So for actual real-time intelligence, what was going on the ground, also reporting back the weather that was going on across Europe so we could actually start to plan. There isn't a single operation, invasion, or any sort of operation tactically wise that went ahead without that critical intelligence. That came from 26 million photographs that were taken in every single theatre of operation from Europe through Africa, Mediterranean and out into the Far East. And it was just 1,746 guys, including Freddie, who carried out that work throughout the entirety of the war. That's less than a typical bomber squadron in Bomber Command, but did everything.
But these guys have almost been forgotten. Of course, when the intelligence came back, it then had to be interpreted. All sorts of extraordinary people doing the interpretation, including one Dirk Bogarde.
That's it, Dirk Bogarde, as well as Lady Charlotte Bonham Carter, so head of the Bonham Carter's aunt. They carried out this work in secret over in Buckinghamshire at a big stately home, and they turned around these reports between 12 and 24 hours every single day, 24/7 throughout the entirety of the war. And it was that information that arrived at what's now the Churchill War Rooms, but was then the Cabinet War Rooms, and it was used by Churchill in the High Command for their strategic planning.
One of Freddie's comrades was shot down and ended up in Stalag Luft 3, and then was part of the Great Escape and was shot for it. Just tell us a little bit about him and how you recovered the plane.
Well, that's right. So the way that we got chatting was there was one particular Spitfire AA-810, that was flown by Freddie on a number of occasions, as well as 4 or 5 other men, of which the last pilot was a young Sandy Gunn, who was an apprentice engineer from Glasgow. He was working in the shipyards up there. He joined up, flew this reconnaissance throughout the war, was shot down, survived, but as we said, became a prisoner of war, and decided to escape as part of the Great Escape. And he was the 68th man out the tunnel, but unfortunately he was one of the 73 caught and one of the 50 murdered by the Gestapo, aged just 24 when he was shot.
An astonishing story. And because, as I say, lots of people don't know about this unit, the PRU, you've been campaigning for a memorial. And we heard this week that you're succeeded.
That's right. So the government has been incredibly supportive, both the last government and the current government. We have over 200 MPs who have signed up from 8 political parties, so it's absolutely fantastic the support we've got. And yes, we've had support from the Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Defence, but very recently we also got the Royal Parks on side, because we're looking to put it outside the Treasury, right next to the Churchill War Room, where that information was used so critically. And of course that falls within a Royal Park. And as you say, this week, within Parliament, it's been announced that we're moving into the planning stage now.
Well done, because a bit of my relative Freddie's Spitfire is sitting inside the RAC Club as we speak.
That's it. Just for a couple of days for VE Day, the Spitfire that he flew, we're restoring it to fly, and it's currently in the RAC on Pall Mall just for VE Day.
I will be along to remember it and him. Thank you very, very much indeed, Tony.
Thank you, Andrew.
Remembering Freddie Malcolm. And we're going to go back to that seismic UK-US trade deal in a few minutes with the Business and Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. But the time now, 6:31, and here is Amelia Cox with the news headlines.
Cardinal Robert Prevost has been named as the new Pope, the first American leader of the Catholic Church. Going forward, he'll be known as Pope Leo XIV. Sir Keir Starmer says it's a historic day following the announcement of a UK-US trade deal. Donald Trump says the final details are still being agreed, but it will see tariffs on steel and aluminium scrapped and those on cars greatly reduced. In return, the UK is removing taxes on American ethanol and has agreed reciprocal access to beef. LBC weather dry and settled tonight for most of the UK, a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC.
At risk.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:33. So now, returning to that trade deal between us and the United States, I'm joined in the studio by Jonathan Reynolds, Secretary of State for Business and Trade, and a man with a big smile on his face.
Well, there's more to do, there always is when it comes to trade, but thousands of jobs have been saved by what has been announced between the President and the Prime Minister today. To be specific about it, we have agreed a process which is ongoing in terms of a whole range of tariffs between the UK and the US. That's the reciprocal tariffs the President had talked about, the 10% the UK was subject to and a lot higher for a lot of other countries. We're on the sectoral tariffs, steel, aluminium, the derivatives of those, automotive, which is a huge economic priority for the UK, pharmaceuticals and some others. We have agreed changes, provisions that without would have been extremely challenging, particularly for automotive. So when I can be in a position to come and talk to you, Andrew, and say, because of action the government has taken, thousands of people are still in work and will be and wouldn't have been without this action, yes, that makes me happy. That puts a smile on my face.
And what about the steel industry? I said earlier on, perhaps this, for the time being, saved the British steel industry. Was that going too far? Was that hyperbole?
The issues around the steel industry are wider than the tariffs that the US had imposed on them. It's an important, but it's a specific market. We've got other things we are addressing and obviously had to take some pretty decisive action quite recently in relation to British steel. But yes, that is an important market, so the tariff there is going to zero which is very, very important. That means, again, on a whole range of things, and we could have continued negotiating the full agreement to try and get it all across the line at once, but by announcing this today, of course, those businesses can plan for the future. They can make decisions knowing we've got that in place. So, look, it is a very, very positive day for the UK.
We have a very important and growing TV and film industry in this country, and the announcement that might face 100% tariffs sent an absolute shockwave through that industry. What's going to happen to that?
The creative industries, in particular film, are a huge economic asset to the UK. It's not just the cultural power of that and the soft power.
So is Trump lifting his tariffs on that?
The US hasn't been clear yet as to what exactly they are proposing putting a tariff on in relation to film. So if you were selling me a car, we know what the tariff would apply to. It's a bit more complicated when it comes to service industry. So they haven't announced exactly what that is. We have language in terms of what we've agreed on sectors relating to areas like film and pharmaceuticals, where there's been a suggestion the US will act but hasn't yet put things in place, guaranteeing we get the chance for the kind of comparable treatment for those that we've had for steel, aluminium, automotive and aerospace. So we don't yet know what the US is specifically proposing on film and TV across the world, but those sectors, as with all the sectors that have specific tariffs in place from the US, are reflected in the language in this deal.
And what about the digital services tax? Have you surrendered that?
No, so there's nothing at all in this deal that relates to the digital services tax, nothing that relates to online harms and the Online Safety Act, nothing that relates to the NHS. I understand why there's always speculation about these things, and you can't be running commentary, then that often feeds further speculation. But no, those things that have been talked about in the UK, not part of it. In relation to, there's additional access for US farmers on beef, greater access being provided on that. That is not the hormone-treated beef that is often, again, in the media here. I want to say very clearly that US food standards are safe. If you're in the US, eat their food, no problem. But we've got a different set of systems in place here, so we haven't changed any of those food standards.
Does this mean that this deal doesn't make it harder, stroke impossible, for us to do a deal with the EU in a week and a half's time?
That's absolutely right. So our food standards, particularly on meat, currently are the same as the EU's, reflecting the fact we were a member, and I think it's fair to say there's no appetite amongst the UK population to change those. It was within the Labour manifesto a very clear commitment that we wouldn't be seeking to change those in any of our trade negotiations that we are seeking to make, it, like, for instance, we've done with India. So it doesn't prevent that. That's really important because after Brexit, trade in food and agriculture has declined significantly with the EU. It's an area where, given we've got the same standards in place, an obvious area, trade-based improvement that we can make, and that is something we're seeking to do. So as ever, we refuse and push back very strongly on anyone who is suggesting that the UK has got to pick between the US, the EU, India, China. You know, we have to have the best relationships with every market.
Well, I have to say, at times I was one of those who thought we might have to choose, given some of the things that Trump was saying and doing. To what extent do you think the personal relationship between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump has been important in this? That's
been massive. I mean, I would say across the board, the personal relationships you have, whether it's heads of state, heads of government to each other, or even what I have with other trade ministers, I'm surprised in a way of how significant I find that. But I suppose when you're doing any negotiation, it's about trust. It's about whether you can take the word of the person on the other side. And look, the UK has a long history. Whoever is the president, whoever is the prime minister, our interests are so close, particularly on security and defence. But the relationship the prime minister has struck in the UK national interest, I think, should be acknowledged and respected.
Well, that's really good to hear. But let me ask you about AI, because one of the things people keep saying is that the heart of any better sort of trading and economic relationship between the UK and the EU and the US is going to be AI. What is the sort of deal there? How does it work?
We are, as part of this, seeking a technology partnership. Actually, the EU broadly has one with the US. We don't have one. We're sort of left out, having left the European Union. So there are things that we would like to work more closely with them. Different parts of the world have had a different approach to the regulation of AI in terms of how they're seeking to get the maximum benefits for themselves out of it. Our approach in the UK, I'd say, is more pro-business than, say, the approach in the EU, which has been a lot more bureaucracy and burdens I think they put in place. So we are a little bit close to the US already on that. And of course, because the biggest tech sector in the world is in the US, but we are the biggest tech sector in Europe, and China's sort of in between us. There's a natural set of things. AI is one of them. There are other things as well that we would naturally be seeking to work with the US on. And this is going to be one of the most defining economic stories for the future. And look, this trade deal comes down to this, because it's often seen as the relationship between the US and the UK, or Prime Minister and President. It's about jobs, it's about economic activity. What we've agreed today with the US, what we agreed earlier in the week with India, the fact the Bank of England has cut interest rates today, these are all the things that we know are important to people, because it's about making them better off.
Now, it's often said the devil is in the detail with these things, and it takes some time for the devils to crawl out, as it were. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, said that we have been shafted with this deal. What's your response to that?
I think if you work in Conservative Central Office and you're listening to this, take Kemi's phone off her and make her read things before she tweets. I understand other people in the Conservative Party have welcomed it, but she hasn't been able to look at the deal. I really don't believe any Conservative leader would say they don't want trade with India, she said earlier in the week. They don't want trade with the US, she's saying today. They don't like the European Union. They don't like China. I mean, who do they want to do trade and business with? But look, this is a great deal for the UK, because otherwise lots of people would have lost their jobs. It's the first deal the US has got to with any country. It puts us again at the front of the queue. And of course, there's now this wider process where we can seek to improve the terms of trade between each other even further.
Let me ask you, as it were, a more general kind of global question about this, because Donald Trump announced the age of tariffs, and it was going to be a complete upending of the entire world trading system. Now he's done this deal, and he said it's the first of many, he says, and he's got his trade secretary off to talk to the Swiss next, I think, and he says the Chinese behind the scene are really trying to do a deal. Do you think it's turning out that actually what's going on is this is Trump's way of getting the attention of lots of countries around the world, and perhaps the age of higher tariffs is not what we're seeing? I mean, markets are beginning to think that way. We're seeing markets rising.
I've spent quite a bit of time understanding, talking to counterparts across the political aisle in the US to understand where they're coming from on this. Now, some people want and believe in the US that tariffs can raise revenue, that could replace income tax. I mean, I think that is quite contested as a theory. But the wider, and I think more important agenda for us to understand, is a sense in the US that the terms of trade they have engaged upon have become unfair to the US. And that is because countries that were once developing countries are now quite significant economies, and they're getting a position which isn't reciprocal, as they would say. It's not the same on both sides. And particularly they object to countries who sell a lot to the US, but don't open their markets for US products.
So there's a logic behind this.
I think, look, I would not endorse the approach because I believe in free and fair trade, but I do understand that the complaints that this US administration have are actually shared across the political divide in some cases. And for instance, the fact that, I mean, China makes a third of everything in the world. That will soon, at this rate, be half of everything in the world. They consume about 10 or 12% of gold. So there is an imbalance. I can
see why anyone would be alarmed about that.
Yeah.
But Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Much appreciated. Now, it's a day dominated by three big stories. We've heard about the trade deal. We've spoken about the new Pope, and we're going to return now to the third story that makes this a pretty historic day, I think, the 80th anniversary of our victory in Europe. A little earlier, I emphasised the importance of remembering individual stories when marking these moments, and that is something the former editor of the Daily Telegraph and eminent historian Sir Max Hastings has done in his new book, Sword, D-Day, Trial by Battle. He told me why it was so important to focus on the lived experience of the soldiers who fought for this country's freedom.
I'm always trying to think of things that people haven't said before. For instance, I was fascinated in an American report, which of course applies to the British as well, showing that in conditions of extreme fear, 1 man in 10 loses control of his bowels, and 1 in 4 pees in his pants. Now, this isn't surprising, but it's not the kind of thing you find
in most
history books. That I'm also fascinated by leadership and how it works and doesn't work. So on and around Sword Beach, you saw some examples of leaders who did fantastically well, fantastically brave, persuaded their men to follow them in suicidal attacks on position.
Lord Lovat being an example.
Well,
perhaps.
he was certainly an example of extreme fear and extreme arrogance. But there were also cases of leaders who failed in that battle, as they always fail. That it's amazing how often in all wars that an officer will stand up and say, "Right, chaps, let's go and get them." And nobody comes after him. And it's terrible how it can happen. And I've told some of these stories that, for instance, there was one battalion on D-Day that was charged with taking a German strong point, codenamed Hillman. Well, it took them 7 hours to do it. And they only lost 7 killed, which was nothing in terms of the D-Day casualties. And I tried to work out why it was that it didn't work. And the first thing that struck me was that all but one of the 7 who were killed were officers. And what that told me was that those officers were trying to persuade their men. Those officers very bravely
attacked,
were charging at the German position, and their men wouldn't follow them. And I've told another story, which again came from the wonderful Imperial War Museum archive, of a commander who was wounded on D-Day, and he found himself back in an English hospital in the next bed to a colonel who'd taken his battalion ashore in Normandy. And the colonel told him that his own father and grandfather had commanded the same battalion in earlier wars, and he'd, with high hopes and all sorts of ideals, led his men ashore onto the battlefield, and they wouldn't follow him. And he felt incredibly humiliated by this experience. And one morning, this commander tells in his narrative of his own experience how he woke up. And he said, I didn't think that colonel was very badly wounded. And yet I found one morning he was dead in his bed. And he said, I think he died of shame. And it's a terrible story. It's a terrible story of a tragedy. But all the time, one's just trying to work out
the realities, the human realities. Yeah,
I'm not trying. I'm not trying to retell the big D-Day story of Montgomery and Rommel. All this, everybody knows all that inside out. I'm trying to look at how ordinary people who found themselves in uniform amid this incredible experience, how they reacted.
We just had the VE Day ceremony in London. For an awful lot of people, particularly younger people, who get their understanding of this from films and TV and so on, it's effectively an American war now, and the British contribution is pushed again and again and again to one side because we're not making the films, we're not writing
that's
the books.
our own fault.
So I just like your reflection on the relative importance still of the British Army at D-Day and more generally.
D-Day was arguably the last big event of the Second World War in which we played the critical role, and Montgomery was in command, and all the major subordinate commanders were all British, and almost half the casualties on D-Day were British and Canadian. But Steven Spielberg has done a great job for Americans with Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers and so on. It's our own fault. And I've often heard British veterans complain, oh, there ain't no British soldiers in Saving Private Ryan and so on. Well, why should there be? That each nation, in the 1950s, we made all those films like The Dam Busters and The Cruel Sea. We've got to get back to that if we want to tell the story.
And, of course, in the Spielberg film about the American bomber pilots, the British, the RAF pilots, are in the pub as kind of sneering, sort of second-rate buffoons and target practice.
Well, in some of the films that we make, the Americans are hanging around looking pretty stupid. So there's always that edge of... and what we also have to remember is although the big people in the war, the Churchills, and realised how absolutely dependent on the Americans we were for supplies, for money, for weapons, for everything, a great many ordinary British people bitterly resented the Yanks. They found the whole business, how the Yanks were taking it all over. And on VE Day, I may say, the bitterness among many British people that we had come out of the Second World War, yes, on the same side as the victors, but we were bankrupt. And the Americans have made a huge cash profit.
That's a very, very important reflection, not just on VE Day, but also on the day that Britain and Trump have struck this new trade deal. Sir Max Hastings, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not to mention the American Pope. Up next, on what has been an extraordinary day, we're going to discuss all of that with my top political panel, but the time now is 6:48.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
Should we be lauding Keir Starmer for a huge diplomatic achievement, or do you, like Kemi Badenoch, think we've been shafted by Donald Trump?
Ian Dale on LBC.
At Morrison's, you can level up your picnic game with 3 for 2 on over 4
060 60 973.
6:50. Now, we say it a lot, and I appreciate I'm at the risk of sounding like a broken record, but today really has been historic, momentous, etc. All of that in politics. I'm just one guy, so I'm very happy to say I'm joined by two of the top panellists to help me dissect all of this. Dan Hodges from the Mail on Sunday and Lizzie Buchan, the political editor at the Mirror. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the big trade deal today, because that's obviously the huge news of the day and probably the huge news of the week. Kemi Badenoch says that we've been shafted, but Nigel Farage, rather interestingly, says it's a step in the right direction and the Brexit freedom. Which of them is the shrewder? Lizzie first.
I think Nigel Farage is more on the money, which is not something I normally say. But
I was hoping you'd say that. just for the pleasure of hearing the Daily Mirror praising Nigel Farage.
Yeah, it won't happen again. I think Kemi Badenoch, it just sounds like she is opposing for the sake of opposing. It was interesting that she put that tweet out, and then around the same time, the Shadow Business Secretary also tweeted saying it was good news for British exporters. So bit of mixed messages from Tory HQ there.
Looking at what it's going to do for car makers, for steel, and for instance, Rolls-Royce, who are going to carry on making the engines for Boeing, it's hard to see how this is anything other than good news.
Well, the deal itself is good news. I mean, I have to say, I wouldn't normally defend Kemi Badenoch, and that's not the best choice of words, but she is obviously, fighting for relevance at the moment. But I do think her critique has some merit, because there's absolutely no doubt that we are better off now than we were 24 hours ago in terms of our trading relationship. But we're still in a worse place than we were 6 months ago. And in net terms, obviously, whilst there are a couple of sectors that will benefit in net terms, we are still facing quite significant tariffs, and that will still remain a significant burden on other sectors.
That's hardly Keir Starmer's fault.
No, everybody's
facing the 10% tariffs.
No, in terms of Keir Starmer, he's defied a lot of his critics by securing this deal, but I don't think we can realistically be breaking out the champagne, seeing, as I say, in net terms, we're still worse off as a country than we were several months ago.
I think what I'd really like to do with you guys is analyse the sort of week from Keir Starmer's point of view, because, you start off at the beginning of the week, it looks really, really bleak. Reform have absolutely hammered Labour, as well as the Conservatives, in these English elections, local elections, and you've got a lot of the Labour Party in more or less open revolt about the winter fuel allowance for pensioners, and indeed hitting the benefits of the disabled. And now by the end of the week, he seems to be turning things around. So a reflection on what's real and what just appears to be good news for him. Lizzie?
I think this is really good news for him. It's what he needed, because it has been a really difficult week. I think the local elections, everybody knew that Reform were going to do well, but I don't think any party strategists, either Labour or Conservative, thought that Reform would do as well as they did. And this, to me, seems to be the moment of greatest vulnerability for Keir Starmer. MPs from across the party, I've been talking to people geographically, politically different, all having the same kind of concerns that perhaps the party strategy is not right, and that the voters did turn out and did say, we don't like the winter fuel cut, we don't like the disability benefit cuts.
Yeah. And for the first time, you're seeing some quite substantial figures, Louise Hayes, the latest one, coming out and actually criticising openly. In other words, that kind of steely discipline that Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer had managed to impose on the Labour Party is beginning to break apart.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been reporting today. There's I think 2 letters, one that was sent today and another one that's being organised both to the Prime Minister by backbenchers saying they can't support the benefit cuts. 42 MPs have signed the first one. We haven't seen anything like this under Keir Starmer before, and a lot of MPs who've never publicly criticised the leadership have decided that enough's enough and that they are prepared to put their heads above the parapet.
And what about the sort of cultural side of the Reform versus Labour debate? I was very, very interested in what Lucy Powell said to Tim Montgomery on the radio at the beginning of the week, where she was kind of sneering at people, raising the idea of there being a national inquiry into the grooming gangs, toot your little trumpet, dog whistle, etc., etc., etc. Now, that is exactly the wrong tone if you're trying to win back those voters, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a disastrous tone. But I mean, I think in relation to Lucy Powell, I mean, I see she's obviously had a lot of personal criticism for it. The reality is Lucy Powell was simply reflecting what the broader Labour Party's view is of this issue, and Labour is just in completely the wrong place on the politics of this. And I think, just to pick up your point, I don't think, obviously, this is good news for Keir Starmer, and he needed this today, but I don't think it's going to change the fundamentals. And if you saw, the key thing for me was if you saw, we had this, this terrible result for Labour and Keir Starmer, but then we had the reaction, and the reaction from Keir Starmer just could not have been worse. So we had his initial reaction, I'm going to go further and faster, which is not.
Well, I'm not against that. I just want to know in which direction he's going to go
that's the
further
problem. We know which direction a lot of his own MPs want him to go. Then we had the gaffe on that from Lucy Powell, which Downing Street then doubled down on. And then we had the backlash against the Indian trade deal, when obviously Indian workers were being seen to get preferential tax rates at a time when national insurance contributions were being hiked in this on British workers and British companies. So the whole tenor of Starmer's response was wrong, and the reality is he and the Labour Party still do not know and still have not worked out yet how to deal with the Nigel Farage threat and the reform threat. They've been so focused on dealing with the Tories, which they've obviously done very successfully, they don't know how to deal with Farage.
And I tend to look at this in terms of policies to respond to Farage, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe the problem with Farage is that he speaks so well, that he has this kind of popular charisma, and that's something that Keir Starmer, for all his many, many virtues, just can't do.
I think there's an element of that. Nigel Farage is a talented politician, but I also think that it's not even about him necessarily. It's about the fact that there is this massive voter apathy and frustration with the political class as a whole, this huge hunger for change that Labour were able to tap into at the general election, and that has fallen away really quickly. Voters are desperate to see things change, and it's very hard to change things quickly.
When you have such a weak, anemic economy, it's very, very easy to vote for change and quite hard in power to deliver it.
Absolutely, and I think this is what the fundamental political problem Keir Starmer has. The reality is he didn't really win the last election. The Conservative Party lost the last election. It wasn't necessarily a vote for him and for Labour. It was, as you say, it was a vote for change. And the perception has now been embedded, rightly or wrongly, that Keir Starmer doesn't represent change. And that, I was out on the doorsteps last week in the local elections, and the thing I heard again and again and again is this thing which is so toxic for Labour and Starmer, which is they're just the same as the other lot. And Farage, without really having to do that much, is now cornering the market, is in a sense cornering the change market.
Cornering the change market. Well, I said right at the beginning that this was a glimmer of hope, a bit of brightness, but it wasn't the new dawn. And I think we'll agree with that. Dan, Lizzie, thank you both very, very much indeed. I will be back with you on Monday. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, but also the brand new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order that you want or prefer, pause and rewind live radio, and also listen to a range of podcasts. So download the all-new official LBC app free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish, but right now it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, it is a kind of free trade deal, but as Captain Kirk might have said, not as we know it. Keir Starmer and Donald Trump are lauding it as hugely significant and a massive deal. But in reality, is it? Former Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch reckons Starmer and the UK have been shafted. But the fact is, it has saved thousands of UK jobs in the motor and steel sectors. We haven't caved on our digital services tax or food standards, and we're the first country to have done a trade deal with Trump. Should we be lauding Keir Starmer for a huge diplomatic achievement, or do you, like Kemi Badenoch, think we've been shafted? At 8, I'll be joined by entrepreneur Simon Squibb, whose new book is called What's Your Dream? Find Your Passion, Love Your Work, Build a Richer Life.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.